promises in the West are cheaper than dirt. Nora learned that when a man who owned 10,000 cattle looked her dead in the eye and told her she wasn't worth the silver ring in his pocket, spat out by the valley left with nothing but a frayed woolen coat and a busted pride, she didn't look for a savior up in the frozen peaks. She was just looking for an empty place to finally rest. What she found was a man forged by the very mountain that tried to kill her. Words hung in the heavy, cigar-scented air of the parlor, settling like dust over the imported Persian rugs. "It's not a matter of affection, Nora. It's a matter of mathematics." Preston Caldwell stood by the massive oak window frame, his back to her. He was looking out over the rolling sea of prairie grass that belonged entirely to him. He wore a tailored broadcloth suit that cost more than Nora's father had earned in 3 years of breaking his back over a plough. Nora Hayes sat on the edge of a velvet settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were bone white. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had somewhere to fall. She just stared at the back of Preston's perfectly combed hair, feeling the chill of the room settle into her ribs. "Mathematics?" she repeated. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor she was fighting to suppress. Preston finally turned. He had a handsome face if you liked your men looking like they belonged on a minted coin, hard, shiny, and entirely unyielding. "Your father's debts are substantial. I purchased the note from the bank out of respect for our arrangement. But a marriage requires a merger of assets, a partnership. You are bringing me a foreclosed patch of dirt and a ledger full of red ink. Josephine Miller is bringing 200 shares of the Union Pacific. We had an agreement, Preston." She didn't shout. Shouting was what he wanted. It would allow him to call her hysterical to justify his pragmatism. "My father died thinking the debt was settled between our families." You shook his hand. "I shook the hand of a dying man to give him peace." Preston corrected, smoothly walking over to his desk. He picked up a leather-bound book and tapped it. "I am a rancher, Nora. I don't run a charity. I am forgiving the debt. I'm letting you walk away clean. That is more generosity than anyone else in this valley would offer you." He was right, and that was the cruelest part. He wasn't a villain out of a dime novel. He was just a businessman who had looked at her, weighed her on a scale, and found her lacking. She wasn't a woman to him. She was a bad investment. Nora stood up. The velvet of the settee released a soft sigh. "You're forgiving the debt because you took the land, Preston. You own the creek access now. You traded a promise for water rights, and now you're marrying a railroad. I am securing my legacy." He didn't flinch. "There's a stagecoach leaving for Cheyenne tomorrow. I've paid for a ticket in your name. There's a boarding house there. You can find work. You're a sensible girl, Nora. You'll survive." She looked around the room. The ticking grandfather clock, the silver tea service, the sterile, suffocating wealth of it all. She had almost traded her life for this room. She had convinced herself she could tolerate the coldness of the man to ensure she never went hungry again. Now the hunger seemed preferable. "I won't be going to Cheyenne," Nora said quietly. Preston frowned. It was the first crack in his polished veneer. "Don't be foolish. You have nothing left here." "I know." She turned toward the heavy mahogany doors. "I'm going up to Placer Ridge. My aunt runs a laundry there." Placer Ridge. Preston scoffed a genuine ugly sound. "That's a 3-day ride through the pass. Winter is snapping at our heels, Nora. It's a mining camp full of degenerates and mud. You won't make it, and even if you do, it's no place for a woman alone. It's a place where I won't have to see your cattle," she said. She didn't look back. Nora walked out of the grand house, down the sweeping wooden steps, and into the biting November wind. The ranch hands watched her go, their faces carefully, blank heads ducked under the brims of their hats. They knew what had just happened. The whole town probably knew by now. Preston Caldwell had dumped the dirt-poor farmer's daughter for the railroad heiress. She walked the 3 miles back to town. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles, kicking up grit that stung her cheeks. She went straight to the livery. The horse she had ridden for 5 years, a gentle mare named Bess, had been seized by the bank. In her pocket, Nora had exactly $14.12, the sum total of her life's savings, hidden in a coffee tin from the bank's liquidators. She bought a stubborn, sway-backed mule named Rust for $10 a sack of hardtack, a bag of dried beans, and a heavy wool blanket. She packed her father's oversized hunting coat, her mother's Bible, and a tin cup. The liveryman, a grey-bearded man named Higgins, watched her saddle the mule. "You shouldn't be heading up the pass, Miss Hayes. The sky over the peaks looks like a bruised thumb. Snow's coming early. I don't have anywhere else to be, Mr. Higgins," Nora said, pulling the cinch tight. The mule pinned its ears back and snapped at the air. "Caldwell's a cold bastard," Higgins muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "But freezing to death on the ridge won't spite him. He won't lose a minute of sleep." "I'm not trying to spite him," Nora said, swinging up into the saddle. The worn leather creaked beneath her. "I'm just trying to survive him." She rode out of town without looking back. She didn't look at the dry goods store where she used to buy peppermint sticks, or the church where her parents were buried in the frozen ground behind the chapel. She kept her eyes fixed on the jagged, imposing teeth of the mountains looming in the distance. They looked harsh, unforgiving, exactly what she needed. By the afternoon of the second day, the world had lost all color. The ascent up Bitterroot Pass was a grueling vertical climb through a narrow canyon of black granite and towering pines. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since she left the valley floor. The air up here was thin, sharp as glass in her lungs. Nora walked ahead of the mule, pulling on the lead rope. The animal was exhausted, its head hanging low, hooves slipping on the loose shale of the switchbacks. Nora's own boots were wearing thin. The soles offered little protection against the jagged rocks. Her father's heavy coat hung off her shoulders like a lead weight, yet the cold seemed to slice right through the canvas and wool, settling deep into her marrow. She stopped to rest against a boulder, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. The silence of the mountains was absolute. In the valley there was always the sound of wind in the grass, the lowing of cattle, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Here there was nothing, just the deafening, pressing quiet of the altitude. She looked up at the sky. Higgins had been right. The clouds weren't just grey. They were a sickly, bruised purple, heavy and sagging over the peaks. The sun was gone, blocked by the gathering storm. "Come on, Rust," she croaked. Her throat felt raw. "Just over the ridge. We just have to make it to the tree line on the other side." The mule snorted a wet, rattling sound, but stepped forward. They made it another mile before the first flakes began to fall. They weren't the soft, drifting flakes of a winter postcard. They were hard-driving pellets of ice propelled by a wind that seemed to scream down the canyon walls. In minutes, the trail was covered. In half an hour, it was erased completely. Nora pulled her scarf up over her nose, squinting against the blinding whiteout. She couldn't see 10 feet in front of her. The wind howled a physical force that shoved her backward, threatening to push her off the narrow ledge. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her chest. Preston's words echoed in her mind. "You won't make it." "Shut up," she whispered, leaning into the wind. "Shut up." She kept moving. Left foot, right foot. Drag the mule. Left foot, right foot. Then came the crack. It sounded like a cannon shot. A massive deadwood pine, heavy with snow and battered by the wind, snapped 50 yards up the slope. It came crashing down, bringing a cascade of rocks and snow with it. The noise terrified the mule. Rust let out a high-pitched bray, his eyes rolling back in his head. Before Nora could tighten her grip, the animal violently jerked his head back. The rough hemp rope tore through Nora's freezing, blistered hands, ripping the skin. No, Rust. She lunged for the rope, but the mule was already scrambling backward down the steep, treacherous incline they had just climbed, taking her blankets, her beans, and her matches with him. She watched him disappear into the swirling white void. Nora stood alone on the trail, her empty hands shaking. Blood oozed from her rope-burned palms, freezing almost instantly in the frigid air. For the first time since she sat in Preston's parlour, a sob broke loose from her throat. It was a pathetic, small sound instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. She had nothing now. No shelter, no fire, no food. Just the clothes on her back, and a mountain that wanted her dead. She stumbled forward, her sense of direction entirely gone. The snow was knee-deep now, dragging at her skirts, making every step a monumental effort. Her legs burned, then began to ache, and finally a terrifying numbness set in. Her toes felt like blocks of wood. Her fingers were stiff, useless claws. The cynic in her whispered that it was over, that this was the logical end to a life that had run out of luck. Preston Caldwell was sitting by a roaring fire right now, drinking scotch, calculating his profits. He would never even know she died up here. She was just an error in his ledger already erased. She fell. Her knee struck a hidden rock beneath the snow. The pain was blinding for a second, and she pitched forward face first into the drift. She tried to push herself up, but her arms simply refused to obey. The cold had seeped into her muscles, turning them to lead. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the chaotic, swirling sky. Snow covered her eyelashes, melting and freezing again, sealing her eyes half shut. Strangely, the panic began to fade. The violent shivering that had racked her body for the last hour slowly stopped. The biting wind didn't feel so sharp anymore. Instead, a heavy, insidious warmth began to spread through her chest. It felt like sinking into a hot bath. It was comfortable. So comfortable. Just close your eyes, the mountain seemed to whisper. It's easier. Let it go. Nora let her head loll to the side. The whiteout was darkening, the edges of her vision turning black. She didn't think of Preston or the ranch or the debt. She just thought of the quiet, the absolute heavy silence. She let her eyes drift shut. The warmth pulled her under. Gerson Kennedy smelled the storm before he saw it. He had lived in the high country of the Bitterroots for 8 years, long enough to learn that the mountain had a voice. You just had to know how to listen. The drop in barometric pressure made the hairs on his arms stand up. The scent of pine resin sharpened, and the elk had moved down into the lower valleys 2 days ago. He was out checking his furthest snare line when the whiteout hit. He didn't panic. Panic killed faster than the cold. He simply adjusted the collar of his thick wolf-skin coat, pulled his beaver pelt hat down low over his brow, and turned his snowshoes toward home. He knew these ridges blind. He navigated by the shape of the wind against the rock faces and the incline of the slopes. He was a massive man, standing 6'4", broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, from a life of chopping wood, dragging carcasses, and surviving. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of a face, scarred by a run-in with a grisly 3 winters past. His eyes were a pale, startling grey, the colour of winter ice. They missed nothing, which was why he stopped when he saw the anomaly. It wasn't much. Just a shape that didn't belong in the natural geometry of a snowdrift. A mound of snow that looked just a little too deliberate, tucked near the roots of a fallen pine. Gerson paused, leaning his weight on his rifle. A dead animal. Maybe a deer that had frozen overnight. He almost kept walking. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was howling, but a sudden sharp instinct tugged at him. He grunted, annoyed by his own curiosity, and waded through the waist-deep drift toward the mound. He used the butt of his rifle to brush away the top layer of snow. Canvas. Wool? Gerson frowned. He dropped to his knees, his massive gloved hands sweeping the snow away frantically. He uncovered a boot, then a leg wrapped in a frozen skirt. Finally, a face. A woman. Her skin was the color of skim milk, a terrifying translucent white. Her lips were a stark, bruised blue. Ice crusted her eyelashes and framed her face in a frozen halo. Gerson pulled off one thick leather glove and pressed 2 calloused fingers against the icy skin of her neck. He held his breath, blocking out the sound of the wind. Thump. A long pause. Thump. She was alive, but just barely. Her pulse was a fading echo. Damn it! Gerson swore the words snatched away by the gale. He didn't want this. He lived up here specifically to avoid people. People brought trouble. They brought noise, complications, and death. And this woman was practically a corpse already. He looked at the sky. He was 2 miles from his cabin. Carrying dead weight through this snow would be brutal. If he left her, she'd be dead in 10 minutes. Nature would take its course. It wasn't his fault she was stupid enough to be up here in a blizzard. He stared down at her face. It was a proud face, even frozen. There was a stubborn set to her jaw that death hadn't quite relaxed yet. Gerson cursed again, louder this time. He shoved his glove back on. He grabbed the lapels of her heavy frozen coat, hauled her up against his chest, and threw her over his broad shoulder like a sack of grain. The next 2 miles were an agony of burning lungs and straining muscles. The wind fought him every step, trying to push him off the mountain, trying to claim the prize he had stolen from it. Gerson didn't stop. He moved with a relentless mechanical rhythm, his snowshoes biting into the powder, his breath roaring in his ears. When the dark, sturdy shape of his log cabin finally appeared through the whiteout tucked into the shelter of a limestone overhang, he nearly dropped to his knees. He kicked the heavy oak door open, stumbled inside, and kicked it shut behind him, plunging the room into dim, smoky warmth. The cabin was one large room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a bed of coals still glowing cherry red. The air smelled strongly of wood smoke, dried sage, and tanned hides. Gerson didn't waste time. He laid the woman down on the thick bear rug in front of the hearth. He threw 3 dry birch logs onto the coals, blowing on them until flames roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the log walls. Then he turned to her. She was stiff as a board. Her clothes were encased in ice, a frozen armor that was trapping the cold against her skin. He knew the rules of survival. Modesty had no place here. With quick, efficient movements, he pulled a hunting knife from his belt. He didn't try to unbutton her frozen coat or dress. He simply hooked the blade under the collars and sliced downward, parting the heavy wool and stiff cotton. He stripped away the wet, freezing layers until she was down to her thin, damp chemise and undergarments. He paused, looking at her. She was horribly thin, her ribs showing beneath the pale skin. Her hands and feet were mottled purple and white. Frostbite. Gerson grabbed a woolen blanket from his bunk, heated it briefly by the fire, and wrapped her tightly in it. He couldn't put her too close to the flames. Warming frostbite too fast caused agonizing tissue damage. It had to be slow. He filled an iron kettle with snow and hung it over the fire, then dragged a wooden stool near the hearth. For the next 3 hours, Gerson Kennedy worked. He heated stones by the fire, wrapping them in rags and placing them at her feet and in her armpits. He dipped clean cloths in lukewarm water, pressing them against her purple fingers, watching the skin. He didn't speak. He just worked. Around midnight, the wind outside settled into a low, mournful moan. The fire cracked and popped. Nora gasped. It was a sharp, jagged sound, a painful intake of air as life came rushing back in. Her body violently jerked, throwing off one of the heated stones. She curled into a tight ball, a whimper tearing from her throat. The thawing process was agony. It felt as though 1,000 hot needles were being driven into her fingers and toes. Gerson leaned forward, his massive hand pressing firmly onto her shoulder to keep her from rolling into the hearth. "Hold still," he rasped. His voice was deep, gravelly from disuse. Nora's eyes flew open. She was disoriented, her vision blurry. The last thing she remembered was the cold, white sky. Now there were dancing orange flames, shadows, and a giant of a man looming over her. The firelight caught the heavy scarring on his cheek and the wild tangle of his beard. He looked like something summoned from the dark corners of a nightmare. She flinched, trying to scramble backward, her breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. Where am I? Stop moving! Gerson ordered, not unkindly, but with a firmness that brokered no argument. "You're thawing out. It's going to hurt like hell. If you move away from the stones, you'll lose those fingers." Nora blinked, her vision focusing. She realized she was wrapped in a rough woolen blanket, completely stripped of her outer clothes. She looked at the man's hands, huge, scarred, smelling of pine pitch and wood smoke. He wasn't hurting her. He was holding a damp cloth over her agonizingly painful hands. "My mule." She managed to whisper, her teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue. Gerson stared at her, his pale grey eyes unreadable. Dead, probably. Long gone. "My coat, my things. Frozen. Cut 'em off you." He pulled back the cloth, inspecting her fingers. The purple was fading into a deep, angry red. Good. The blood was flowing. "You're lucky to have your nose. What kind of fool takes the pass in a November storm on foot?" The bluntness of the question stung, snapping Nora out of her daze. The cynical defensive shell she had built up in Preston Caldwell's parlour snapped back into place. The kind of fool who didn't have a choice. She shot back, her voice shaking from the cold and the pain. She glared at him, though she felt entirely small and vulnerable wrapped in his blanket on his floor. "I didn't ask you to drag me in here." Gerson's jaw tightened. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look at her with the calculating assessment of Preston Caldwell. He looked at her the way he looked at a wounded hawk he'd pulled from a snare, wild, dangerous, and entirely out of place. "No," Gerson finally said, his voice dropping an octave low and resonant. He sat back on his stool, letting go of her shoulder. "You didn't. But you're here. And until the snow clears in 4 days, you ain't going anywhere." He stood up, his massive frame towering over her in the firelight. "Try not to die on my rug. It's a bear to clean." Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a slow grey thinning of the dark. Nora woke to the smell of rendered fat and strong, bitter coffee. For a terrifying second her mind scrambled, expecting the sterile scent of lemon oil and beeswax from Preston's parlour. Then the dull, throbbing ache in her hands and feet grounded her. She opened her eyes to the rough-hewn logs of the cabin ceiling. She was in a bed. It was a narrow frame, built into the corner of the room, piled high with heavy, musky furs. Gerson Kennedy was across the room, his broad back to her, as he stood over a cast-iron stove. He was wearing suspenders over a faded thermal shirt, his muscles rolling beneath the fabric, as he worked a wooden spoon through a cast-iron skillet. Nora tried to sit up. Her body screamed in protest. Every muscle felt as though it had been beaten with a wooden mallet. She gasped, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. Gerson didn't turn. "Don't rush it. Your blood's still figuring out how to pump right." She looked down. Beneath the thick wolf pelt, she was wearing a massive red flannel shirt that smelled of cedar and sweat. It reached past her knees. Her legs were bare, her toes wrapped in clean, rough bandages. She remembered him cutting off her frozen clothes. A flush of heat crept up her neck, a mixture of shame and stubborn pride. "My clothes," she rasped. Her voice sounded like cracked, dry earth. "Burned 'em," Gerson said, finally turning around. He held 2 tin mugs. He walked over his heavy boots, silent on the plank floor, and offered her one. "They were shredded and soaked through, unless you wanted to wear frozen rags." Nora hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers were stiff, swollen, and bright red. They trembled violently as she tried to grip the handle. Before she could drop it, Gerson's massive calloused hand covered hers, steadying the mug until she had a secure hold. His touch was rough, like coarse sandpaper, but incredibly warm. He didn't linger. He pulled back the second she had it. "Drink," he ordered, walking back to the stove. "It's got chicory in it. Tastes like dirt, but it'll wake up your insides." It did taste like dirt. It was scalding bitter, and the best thing she had ever consumed. She drank it greedily, feeling the heat trace a line down her chest. She watched him from the bed. The cabin was a single large room, ruthlessly pragmatic. Rifles and steel traps hung from pegs on the walls. Racks of drying herbs and strips of jerky dangled from the rafters. There were no pictures, no curtains, no useless ornaments. In Preston's world, every object was a testament to wealth. Here, every object was a tool for survival. How long? Nora asked, staring at the window. It was entirely caked in white. The wind was still battering the glass, a relentless, howling assault. Drifts are 10 feet high against the door, Gerson said, dishing a massive portion of fried potatoes and salt pork onto a tin plate. He set it on the small wooden table in the center of the room. Storm won't break for another 2 days. Digging out will take another. You're stuck here. He brought a second plate over and set it on the edge of the bed. He tossed a heavy pair of canvas trousers beside it. Put those on when you can stand. Roll the cuffs. I ain't running a hospital and I don't wait on people. Nora's jaw clamped shut. The implication stung, hitting the bruised parts of her ego. A burden. That was all she was to any man. A bad investment to Preston, an unwanted chore to Gerson. I didn't ask to be waited on. She snapped, her voice finding its edge. She set the mug down on the floor, ignoring the sharp pain in her fingers, and pushed the heavy furs aside. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The cold air of the cabin hit her bare skin. She stood. Her legs shook violently, her knees threatening to buckle. The floorboards were freezing against her bandaged feet. But she locked her jaw, staring a hole into the log wall opposite her, and forced herself to remain upright. Gerson paused his fork halfway to his mouth. He watched her from the table, his pale grey eyes narrowed in quiet assessment. He didn't offer to help. He just watched. Nora grabbed the heavy canvas trousers. Her swollen fingers fumbled clumsily with the brass buttons. It took her 3 agonizing minutes to pull them on and roll the cuffs up enough so she wouldn't trip. Every movement sent a fresh wave of fire through her extremities. By the time she finished, she was out of breath and sweating despite the chill in the room. She limped over to the table and sat heavily in the wooden chair opposite him. She picked up her fork. Her hand shook so badly the tines clattered against the tin plate. I intend to repay you, Nora said, her voice tight with exertion. She stared down at her plate, refusing to look at his scarred face. For the food and the shirt. Once the pass clears, I'll find work in Plaister Ridge. I'll send the money down. Gerson let out a short, grating sound. It took her a second to realize it was a laugh. Money, he muttered, shaking his head. He shoved a piece of salt pork into his mouth. Up here, paper dollars make good fire starter. Coins are just heavy dirt. Don't owe me a thing, city girl. I pulled you out of the drift because I didn't want the stench of a rotting corpse ruining my hunting grounds come spring. Nora finally looked up, her eyes blazing. My name is Nora, and I'm a farmer's daughter, not a city girl. I know how to work. Good, Gerson said flatly, his expression unchanging. He pointed his fork toward a massive pile of split logs by the door. Because the fire needs feeding, and I've got traps to mend. Eat your pork. You look like a stiff wind would snap you in half. He went back to his food. Nora stared at him, anger warring with a strange, unfamiliar relief. There were no hidden games here, no polite lies over tea. Gerson Kennedy was entirely abrasive, completely uncivilized, and entirely honest. She gripped her fork, stabbed a piece of potato, and began to eat. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the silence inside the cabin had taken on a weight of its own. It wasn't the dead, crushing silence of the mountain peak. It was an expectant, heavy quiet. The storm raged on outside, an invisible monster clawing at the thick log walls. Inside, the heat from the cast-iron stove made the air thick and drowsy. Nora couldn't sit still anymore. Her hands were still tender, the skin peeling and raw, but the swelling had gone down. Her feet ached when she put weight on them, but they held her. Sitting on the edge of the bed while Gerson worked was driving her mad. It reminded her too much of the year she had spent sitting in Preston's parlor, waiting for a man to dictate her future. Gerson was sitting by the hearth, the orange light catching the severe angles of his face. He was working a block of beeswax over the leather strap of a heavy steel trap, his massive hands moving with surprising methodical grace. He hadn't spoken 10 words to her since breakfast. Nora stood up. She walked over to the wooden wash basin, splashing freezing water onto her face. She dried off with a rough towel and turned to the room, assessing it with a critical eye. The floor was covered in sawdust and tracked-in snow. A pile of ragged, torn shirts sat on a wooden crate near the stove. The skillet from morning was sitting on the iron grate crusted with grease. Without a word, Nora grabbed the iron kettle, filled it with water from the interior rain barrel, and hauled it onto the stove. She found a block of harsh lye soap and a scrap of coarse cloth. She dragged a wooden stool to the stove and began to scrub the skillet. The hot water stung her raw hands terribly, but she welcomed the pain. It was sharp real and entirely under her control. Gerson stopped working. He didn't look up, but the rhythmic sound of leather on wax ceased. "Leave it." Nora kept scrubbing, digging her thumb into a stubborn patch of burned fat. "I eat off this pan. I'm washing it." "I said leave it." Gerson repeated, his voice low, a gravelly rumble of warning. "I don't need a maid. And I don't need charity." Nora shot back, scrubbing harder. The skillet clanged loudly against the iron grate. "I told you I know how to work. You provided the roof and the food. I provide the labor. It's a transaction. I won't owe you." Gerson finally looked up. He set the trap down on the hearth, rising to his full, imposing height. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping right behind her stool. The sheer size of him blocked the warmth of the stove. Nora stiffened her hands, freezing in the soapy water, but she didn't turn around. "You think everything is a ledger?" Gerson asked quietly. His voice was right by her ear, smelling of pine pitch and old leather. Nora stared at the dirty water. Preston's face flashed in her mind. "It's a matter of mathematics, Nora." "In my experience," she said, her voice tight, "everything has a price. I'm just paying mine up front so nobody can claim I shorted them." Gerson stood there for a long moment. He looked down at her hands, submerged in the scalding water, red and shaking slightly from the effort. He saw the stubborn set of her shoulders beneath his oversized flannel shirt. He reached out. Nora flinched, expecting him to pull her away from the stove. Instead, his large, calloused hand bypassed her entirely. He reached to the wooden peg above the stove and pulled down a clean, dry rag. He dropped it onto the stool beside her. "When you're done with the pan," Gerson said, his voice stripped of its previous hostility. "There's a tear in the shoulder of my canvas coat. Needles and sinew are in the tin box on the mantel." He turned and walked back to his trap by the fire. Nora let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She looked at the dry rag, then at the broad back of the mountain man sitting on the floor. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a sweet nothing. It was an acknowledgement. He was giving her a job. He was letting her earn her space. "I'll need better light if you want the stitches to hold," Nora said, keeping her tone completely neutral. "Move the lantern closer," Gerson replied, not looking up from his leather strap. "And don't waste the sinew. It's hard to come by." For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the cabin were the howling wind outside, the crackle of the fire, and the rhythmic pull of thread through heavy canvas. Nora sat near the hearth, her back aching, her fingers throbbing, as she pushed the heavy steel needle through the thick material of his coat. She stole glances at him. He was a terrifying-looking man. The scar on his cheek looked like a jagged lightning bolt pulling the skin tight. But his hands were steady. He treated his tools with a quiet reverence. There was no arrogance in his posture, no desperate need to prove his worth to an audience. He simply existed grounded and immovable, like the mountain itself. "Grizzly?" Nora asked suddenly. The word slipped out before her cynical brain could stop it. She nodded toward his cheek. Gerson paused. He ran a thumb over the leather strap. He didn't look at her. Cougar. 3 winters ago. Starving female came through the roof of the lean-to I was using. Did you kill it? Had to. He said, his voice flat. Didn't want to. She was just doing what she had to do to survive. He finally turned his head, fixing those pale, icy eyes on her. Mountain doesn't care if you're good or bad, right or wrong. Gerson said softly. It just tests how bad you want to stay breathing. You fought the snow. You survived. That makes you tougher than most men I've met. He looked back at his work. Stitches are crooked. He muttered. Nora looked down at the coat. The stitches were perfectly straight. A tiny, completely unexpected smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She didn't let it show. She just pulled the sinew tighter, anchoring the thread. For the first time since she left the valley, Nora felt warm. The wind died on the morning of the 5th day. It didn't fade gradually. It simply stopped, as if the mountain had finally drawn a full breath and held it. Nora woke to a silence so profound it made her ears ring. The ambient, aggressive roar that had been the soundtrack of her existence for nearly a week was gone. She sat up in the narrow bunk, pulling the heavy furs tightly around her shoulders. The cabin was freezing. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a fragile bed of grey ash. Across the room, Gerson was already moving. He was fully dressed in his heavy canvas trousers and the coat Nora had mended. He held a flat-edged iron shovel in one hand and was staring at the heavy oak door. Is it over? Nora asked, her voice hushed, unwilling to break the stillness. For now, Gerson replied. He didn't turn around. He shoved the iron bolt back and pulled the heavy latch. The door didn't budge. He threw his massive shoulder against the wood with a dull thud. It moved perhaps an inch before hitting a solid wall of resistance. The snow had drifted entirely over the entryway, sealing them in an icy tomb. Gerson grunted. He stepped back, raised the shovel, and began to chip away at the sliver of white visible through the crack. Nora didn't stay in bed. She threw off the furs, ignoring the stiff ache in her healing feet, and pulled on the canvas trousers and the oversized flannel. She walked to the stove, grabbing the poker to coax the dying embers back to life. She fed the fire with kindling her movements quick and efficient. She didn't ask how she could help. She knew better by now. She just found a task and completed it. It took Gerson 3 hours of grueling, methodical labor to carve a tunnel through the drift. He worked with a relentless mechanical rhythm. Thrust, lift, throw, thrust, lift, throw. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt, despite the sub-zero temperature radiating from the snowpack. When he finally breached the surface, the light that flooded into the dim cabin was blinding. Nora stepped up behind him, shielding her eyes with a hand. As her vision adjusted, the breath caught in her throat. The world outside was unrecognizable. The jagged black rocks and towering green pines were buried under a smooth, unbroken ocean of white. The sky was an intense, violent blue, entirely devoid of clouds. The sun glared off the fresh powder with a harsh, crystalline brilliance that made her eyes water. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Don't stare at it too long, Gerson warned, leaning heavily on the handle of his shovel. His chest heaved with deep, controlled breaths. Snow blindness will cook your retinas in an hour. Nora lowered her hand, squinting. The sheer scale of the landscape made her feel incredibly small. In the valley she had known every fence line, every irrigation ditch, every boundary Preston Caldwell had drawn on a map. Up here there were no boundaries. There was only the brutal indifference of the high country. How deep is it? She asked. 4 feet on the level, Gerson said, wiping a gloved hand across his brow. Drifts are twice that. It'll settle in a day or 2. He turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open to air out the musky, smoke-filled cabin. The shift in the weather fundamentally changed the atmosphere in the small room. For 5 days they had been trapped in a state of suspended animation, unified by the simple necessity of staying warm. Now the door was open. The world had returned. Nora spent the afternoon helping Gerson sort through his winter stores. They worked in tandem, moving heavy sacks of flour and dried beans away from the damp exterior walls. They didn't speak much, but the silence had lost its abrasive edge. It was a functional, comfortable quiet. She watched him lift a 50-pound sack of salt, with one hand his muscles coiling effortlessly beneath his shirt. He was a man entirely suited to his environment. Preston Caldwell paid men to build his empire, delegating the physical toll of the frontier to ranch hands while he sat in a leather chair. Gerson Kennedy was the frontier. He owned nothing but what he could carry and defend, yet he seemed infinitely more secure. "You're staring," Gerson noted, mildly dropping the sack onto a dry wooden pallet. Nora didn't look away or apologize. "I was just thinking about the ledger." Gerson paused, dusting the coarse salt from his thick leather gloves. He looked at her, his pale grey eyes steady. And I think your math is better than the bank's," Nora said quietly. A muscle in Gerson's jaw ticked. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on his scarred face. He turned back to the provisions, but the tension in his shoulders had eased. That night they ate roasted elk venison and hardtack. The fire crackled cheerfully. For the first time since her father died, Nora didn't feel the crushing weight of impending ruin hovering over her head. She was sitting in a freezing cabin on a hostile mountain, wearing another man's clothes, and she felt entirely, utterly safe. It was a dangerous realization. By the 8th day, the snow crust had hardened to a thick, icy shell. The temperature hovered in the single digits, but the sun remained bright and merciless. The mountain was passable. Nora sat on the edge of the bunk, staring at her feet. She was wearing a pair of thick woolen socks Gerson had given her, her swollen toes finally returning to their normal color. Beside her sat a small canvas sack containing dried meat, a tin cup, and a heavy wool blanket. It was a far better kit than the one she had lost with her mule. Gerson was by the hearth kneeling over a pair of ash wood snowshoes. He was lacing thick strips of rawhide through the frames, his massive hands moving with practiced precision. The silence in the cabin today wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with the things neither of them wanted to say. "Placer Ridge is 12 miles north of the pass," Gerson said suddenly. His voice was rougher than usual, scraping against the quiet. "The trail cuts through a narrow ravine. It's prone to avalanches after a dump like this. You need to stick to the tree line on the western ridge. Don't walk the center." "Western ridge," Nora repeated dutifully. She traced a pattern on the canvas sack with her thumb. "How long will it take?" "A day and a half if you keep a hard pace. There's a mining dugout halfway. It's abandoned, but it's got 3 walls and a roof. You can winter the night there." He pulled a knot tight with a sharp jerk of his wrist. "Don't build a big fire. The smoke draws wolves." Nora nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. She felt a cold knot tightening in her stomach, a sensation entirely separate from the winter air. She had nowhere to go. Placer Ridge was a desperate hope, a mud-soaked mining camp full of men who viewed women as either commodities or nuisances. She would end up washing their filthy clothes in freezing water until her hands bled, just to earn enough coin to buy stale bread. It was a slow, grinding death of a different kind. But she couldn't stay here. Gerson had made it explicitly clear from the moment he dragged her through the door. She was an anomaly, an unwanted complication in his solitary existence. He had saved her life, clothed her, and fed her. The debt was immense, and staying longer would only make her a permanent burden. She refused to be a burden again. Gerson stood up, holding the finished snowshoes. He walked over and dropped them at her feet. They were large, but he had adjusted the leather bindings to fit her smaller boots. "Try them on," he ordered. Nora slipped her boots into the bindings. Gerson didn't step back. He dropped to one knee in front of her, his large hands reaching out to pull the leather straps tight across her ankles. His proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the wood smoke in his beard, the clean, sharp scent of pine needles, and the raw, masculine heat radiating from his skin. Her heart kicked against her ribs, a frantic, confusing rhythm. "Too tight?" he asked, looking up. His face was mere inches from hers. The severe scarring on his cheek didn't look frightening anymore. It looked like a map of survival, a testament to his sheer will to live. His pale eyes searched hers, entirely stripped of their usual guarded indifference. There was a fierce, turbulent energy swirling behind them. "No," Nora whispered. Her voice trembled. She hated the weakness in it, but she couldn't stop it. "They're fine." Gerson didn't let go of the straps. His hands remained wrapped around her ankles, his thumbs resting against the heavy leather of her boots. He stared at her, the muscle in his jaw working furiously. "Placer Ridge is a cesspool," he stated bluntly. "I know. The men there are desperate. They haven't seen a woman in months. They'll look at you like a slab of meat. I know how to handle desperate men." Nora said, her cynical edge flaring up as a defense mechanism. "I survived Preston Caldwell." Gerson's grip tightened slightly on her boots. "Caldwell is a coward who fights with a pen. The men in the Ridge fight with pickaxes and bad whiskey. You won't last a week." Nora's temper snapped. The sheer injustice of her situation, the absolute lack of choices, boiled over. She yanked her foot back, breaking his grip, and stood up abruptly. The snowshoes clattered against the floorboards. "Then what would you have me do?" "Gerson," she demanded, her voice echoing off the log walls. "Should I walk back down to the valley and beg for a job mucking out Preston's stables? Should I sit in a snowbank and let the mountain finish the job you interrupted? I don't have a grand estate. I don't have a family. I have a canvas sack and a pair of borrowed snowshoes." She pointed a shaking finger at the heavy wooden door. "You told me from day one that I was a problem. You didn't want a maid, you didn't want company, and you certainly didn't want a stray woman cluttering up your cabin. So I am leaving. I am removing the problem. You can go back to your silence." She expected him to yell back. She expected the mountain man to rise to his full, intimidating height and assert his dominance, just as every man in her life had done when challenged. Instead, Gerson stayed on one knee. He looked up at her, the anger completely draining from his harsh face, leaving behind something raw and devastatingly vulnerable. He looked like a man who had just taken a bullet to the chest and was slowly realizing the wound was fatal. "I never said you were a problem," Gerson said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that cut straight through her defenses. "I said I didn't want to find a corpse." He slowly pushed himself up to his feet. He towered over her, yet he didn't crowd her space. He stood perfectly still, his massive hands hanging empty at his sides. "I've lived on this ridge for 8 years, Nora. I know the sound of the wind, the tracks of the elk, the smell of the ice. I know exactly how everything works." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "And then I pulled you out of the snow, and the whole damn mountain shifted." Nora froze. The anger evaporated, replaced by a sudden intense heat that flushed her cheeks. She couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin felt incredibly thin. Gerson looked down at the snowshoes, then back up to her eyes. "You can walk to Placer Ridge," he said, his voice entirely steady, now stripped of all pretense. "I'll give you the map, the food, and the gear. You can walk out that door, and I won't stop you." He took one half step closer. "But if you walk out that door—" Gerson continued, holding her gaze with a ferocious, unyielding intensity. "You are going to take the only fire left in this cabin with you." Silence rushed back into the room, but it was no longer empty. It was thick, charged with the sudden, terrifying collision of 2 solitary lives. Nora stared up at the giant of a man. Her cynical mind scrambled for a defense, for a sharp retort, to deflect the raw honesty hanging between them. She wanted to tell him he was crazy, that he had lived on the mountain too long, that men only spoke like that in cheap, penny dreadfuls. But looking into his pale, grey eyes, she found zero deception. Gerson Kennedy did not play games. He did not waste words. Every syllable he spoke was carved from the same hard truth as the granite outside. He was offering her the one thing Preston Caldwell had brutally stripped away a choice. Nora looked down at her heavy boots firmly strapped into the ashwood snowshoes. She looked at the canvas sack sitting on the bed. Then she looked at the door. On the other side was a freezing 12-mile trek to a miserable mining camp, where she would trade her dignity for survival. She reached down her fingers, trembling slightly, and unbuckled the thick rawhide straps. She kicked the snowshoes off. They hit the floorboards with a sharp, definitive clatter. Gerson let out a slow, ragged exhale. The rigid tension in his broad shoulders collapsed. He didn't smile, but a profound, anchoring relief washed over his scarred features. "I don't know how to trap," Nora said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, betraying the fear she was trying to swallow. "I don't know how to shoot. I will eat your winter stores. I will be a burden. I never asked you to trap," Gerson replied, closing the half-step between them. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I asked you to stay." He reached out. This time there was no hesitation. His massive, calloused hands framed her face. His palms were rough, scraping against her cheekbones, but his touch was incredibly deliberate. He held her like something rare, something irreplaceable. Nora closed her eyes, a shudder ripping through her spine as the last of her defensive armor shattered. She leaned into his palm. Gerson lowered his head, pressing his forehead against hers. They stood there in the center of the dim cabin, breathing in the same harsh, pine-scented air. When he kissed her, it was not the polite, sterile pressure Preston had once offered in an overly furnished parlor. It was a desperate grounding claiming. It tasted of wood-smoke chicory and the raw, desperate edge of survival. Nora grabbed the lapels of his heavy canvas coat, grounding herself against the sheer, immovable mountain of the man. The winter that followed was the longest and darkest of Nora's life, yet she had never felt so violently alive. The mountain tested them daily. January brought winds that threatened to tear the log roof from its rafters. February buried the cabin in back-to-back blizzards that forced them to dig a trench to the woodpile just to keep from freezing to death in their sleep. They lived in extreme proximity. There was nowhere to hide, no separate rooms to retreat into when mood soured or exhaustion set in. They learned the ugly, unpolished realities of one another. Gerson was notoriously stubborn, prone to long, brooding silences when a snare line failed or a predator raided their meat cache. Nora was sharp-tongued and fiercely independent, refusing to let him take over tasks she had assigned to herself, even when her hands blistered from chopping kindling. They argued over the rationing of the flour. They bickered about the right way to render fat. But beneath the friction, a deep, unbreakable partnership was forging. Nora learned to read the sky. She learned to mend leather, to track the small game that scurried across the snow crust, and to shoot Gerson's heavy rifle without bruising her shoulder. She stopped seeing herself as a farmer's daughter who had lost her inheritance. She became a woman of the ridge. Gerson, in turn, began to soften around the edges. He started bringing back small, useless things from his scouting trips, a perfectly smooth riverstone, a cluster of dried winterberries, a shed antler with a unique curve. He never made a grand presentation of them. He simply left them on the small wooden table beside her tin cup. It was his quiet, gruff way of proving that she was always on his mind. They spent the long, dark evenings sitting by the hearth. Gerson would whittle wood, and Nora would read from her mother's battered Bible, not for the religion but for the sound of a voice filling the void. At night, curled together beneath the heavy furs, the howling wind outside sounded less like a threat and more like a lullaby. The cold could no longer reach her. She was anchored to the warmest thing in the territory. May arrived with a violent, muddy release. The ice cracked loudly along the high creeks. The massive snowdrifts began to weep, turning the slopes into treacherous, rushing waterfalls. The brutal, blinding white gave way to patches of black earth, and finally to the vibrant, shocking green of alpine grass. Nora stood on the small wooden porch Gerson had repaired, a cool spring breeze lifting the hair off her neck. She wore a tailored canvas dress she had stitched herself from spare material, her feet encased in sturdy leather boots. Her face was tanned, her shoulders squared, and the frail, exhausted girl who had crawled up Bitterroot Pass was dead and gone. Gerson stepped out onto the porch behind her. He dropped 2 heavy canvas sacks of furs onto the planks. He wrapped a thick arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Trail's clear," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. "Mud's thick, but the pass is open. We can make the valley in 2 days." Nora leaned back into him, looking down at the jagged descent. "Trading day. We need coffee, salt, flour." Gerson traced the line of her hip. "And a proper coat for you before next winter. Canvas won't cut it again." Nora turned in his arms, resting her hands on his broad chest. "Are you sure you want to go all the way to the valley? We could go north to Placer Ridge. The valley trading post pays better for prime beaver pelts," Gerson said pragmatically. His pale eyes searched hers, catching a flicker of hesitation. "You don't have to see him, Nora. If Caldwell crosses my path, I'll break his jaw before he can open his mouth." Nora smiled a genuine, completely unburdened expression. She reached up, running a thumb over the deep scar on his cheek. "I'm not afraid of Preston Gerson. He's just a ghost." 2 days later, the mountain man and the woman he had pulled from the ice rode a pair of sturdy pack mules down into the lush, sprawling valley. The air down here was thick-smelling of blooming clover and damp earth. The town of Oakhaven had hardly changed. The livery still smelled of wet hay, the bank still looked like an imposing brick fortress, and the townsfolk still stared from the wooden boardwalks. They walked into the general store. The bell above the door chimed loudly. Gerson dropped the heavy bales of fur onto the long wooden counter, startling the clerk. As the clerk nervously began to tally the pelts, the door chimed again. Nora didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sharp scent of bay rum and expensive cigar smoke cut through the smell of dry goods. Well," a polished, familiar voice echoed through the quiet store. "I heard rumors you didn't freeze to death, Nora. I see the mountain spit you back out." Nora turned slowly. Preston Caldwell stood near the doorway, flanked by 2 ranch hands. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his boots polished to a high shine. He looked exactly the same, handsome, cold, and calculating. He swept his eyes over her, taking in her plain canvas dress, her rough hands, and her lack of finery. His lips curled into a faint, patronizing smirk. He had expected her to come crawling back, broken and begging. "Preston," Nora said evenly. Her voice didn't shake. Her pulse didn't quicken. Looking at him now, she didn't see power or wealth. She saw a profoundly small man trapped in a prison of his own, desperately hoarding dirt and paper to convince himself he mattered. Preston's gaze shifted to the massive, terrifying figure standing beside her. Gerson hadn't moved aggressively, but his mere presence filled the room. The mountain man stared at the wealthy rancher with the exact same detached clinical evaluation he used to size up a cornered rat. "I suppose you found yourself a guide." Preston sneered, though he took a subtle half-step backward. "If you're here to ask for a loan, Nora, the answer is still no. Josephine and I are consolidating the northern pastures. We don't have capital for charity cases." Nora laughed. It was a bright, genuine sound that bounced off the wooden rafters, completely startling Preston. "I don't need your capital, Preston," Nora said, stepping up to the counter and scooping the heavy cloth sack of gold and silver coins the clerk had just pushed across the wood. It was an entire winter's worth of survival, weighed and paid for. She turned back to the rancher, her chin held high. "You keep your pastures and your ledgers. I have everything I need." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need his validation. Nora walked past Preston, her shoulder brushing his sleeve without a second thought. Gerson followed right behind her, pausing just long enough to lock eyes with Preston. The rancher swallowed hard, thoroughly out of his depth, and looked away. They walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The town felt small now. The entire valley felt incredibly small. Gerson untied the mules from the hitching post. He handed Nora her reins. "Did you get everything you wanted?" he asked quietly, the gravelly rumble of his voice washing over her like a warm blanket. Nora looked up at the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroots in the distance. They no longer looked harsh or unforgiving. They looked like home. She looked back at the scarred, formidable man who had shown her how to conquer them. "I did," Nora said, swinging up into the saddle. "Let's go home, Gerson." They turned their mules away from the dusty streets and the sprawling cattle ranches, riding back towards the tree line, leaving the valley and its empty promises far behind. Nora had walked away from 10,000 cattle and a silver ring only to climb into the freezing sky and find a man who made her his greatest treasure. If Nora and Gerson's journey proved that the greatest treasures aren't found in a ledger but forged in the harshest winters, then this story is for you. Don't let the mountain's fire fade. Smash that like button to keep the cabin warm. Share this video with fellow frontiersmen and romance lovers who crave gritty, deeply human tales of survival and second chances. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our upcoming Wild West epics. Your support keeps these rugged stories alive. Until next time, stay fierce, stay wild, and keep blazing your own trails.